Thank you for joining me here for the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is day 258 for Monday, September 14th, 2020, with Hosea chapters 5 through 9 being discussed. So, here are 5 chapters for you today. In Hosea chapter 5, Hosea continues his critique of Israel and then mentions often the tribe of Ephraim. I'm not exactly sure why the tribe of Ephraim is mentioned here specifically. My first speculation is that it's because Ephraim is a large, influential, and particularly dysfunctional tribe. And so I was thinking speculation is not exactly what I'm trying to do here. So I looked back through our notes from this past year, all of the Daily Bread Bible studies, and found out I was wrong in some ways. So first, Ephraim may have been influential, that's fair to say, but it was not large. Now, Ephraim was the leading tribe of the west, in charge over Manasseh and Benjamin. This is from Numbers chapter 2, when it was dictating the numbers of the tribes as they were stationed there in the wilderness around the tabernacle, a tent of meeting, as it would move across the wilderness of Sinai and the wilderness journeying towards the promised land. It became the second smallest tribe in Numbers 26, and so its numbers dwindled. Maybe the numbers went back up, I'm not sure, but I don't have any indication that it was a large tribe. And we go to Joshua chapter 16. He was from the tribe of Ephraim. But Joshua in verse 10 shows that they continued to contribute to the dysfunction by allowing the influence of Canaanite gods to remain. Namely, in verse 10, they did not, however, drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived with Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor. So the Canaanite influence being connected with Ephraim, it feels like that could lead to this current idolatry that is referenced of Ephraim in Hosea. So another note about Ephraim, they do escalate conflict with Judah specifically. It was originally the tribe of Ephraim following Jeroboam the first, his lead, Jeroboam son of Nebat, that separated from the nation of Israel, and specifically the tribe of Judah, who was ruling over that with King David and also King Solomon. So in 1 Kings 11:26, Jeroboam son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, rebelled against the king. So Jeroboam rebelled against Solomon. He escapes into Egypt. And then when Rehoboam comes around after Solomon, that officially splits the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. In Isaiah chapter 9, closely related with when Hosea takes place, is my assumption, that Judah is attacked by their kindred, especially Ephraim and Manasseh. So I include all of this background in order to make it clear that Ephraim is bringing up conflict and has a history of conflict, especially with the tribe of Judah. And so these nations of Israel and Judah very much pivoted around Ephraim with conflict in this tribe. I will say that at the same time, Hosea chapter 5 and the chapters on after this help us understand that ultimately everyone is guilty. Even Judah is guilty of falling and worshiping other gods. In verse 9 of chapter 5, Ephraim shall become a desolation in the day of their punishment. Among the tribes of Israel I will declare what is sure. The princes of Judah have become like those who remove the landmark. On them I will pour out my wrath like water. Continuing on in Hosea 6, verse 1, come, let us return to the Lord, For it is he who has torn, he who will heal us. He has struck down, and he will bind us up. Israel and Judah are compared to dew that evaporate before being really committed to the ground to help the grass grow, the flowers grow, help produce anything. They just evaporate before they can help. In verse 6 of chapter 6, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offering. So this sentiment is again said where the sacrificial system is having its challenge, that people may be observing this ritual, but there's no meaning behind it. There's no intention to change. There's no willingness to be repentant of the reasons that they need to sacrifice in the first place. So it's hard hearts that God is dealing with. In Hosea chapter 7, verse 3, by their wickedness they make the king glad, and the officials by their treachery. They are all adulterous. So this goes what has been common through these prophets, talking about the ways in which that they've not listened to the prophets and only listened to prophets who speak favorably towards the king in order to support the kingdom and to be yes men instead of speaking for change that is helpful. Hosea then uses some metaphors, including kindled like an oven, a cake not turned, gray-haired, and silly like a dove. I find these metaphors not to be particularly helpful for me in this day and time, but the idea is that Hosea is just trying to come up with metaphors that people would be familiar with in their day and time to say that these nations are not doing well. God then has these words for the nation's tribes in verse 15 of chapter 7. It was I who trained and strengthened their arm, yet they plot evil against me. They turn to do that which does not profit. They have become like a defective bow. Their officials shall fall by the sword because of the rage of their tongue. So much for their babbling in the land of Egypt. They are turning to all sorts of other things except turning to God. Their hearts are in their own directions, trying to pursue what they think are in their best interest instead of following what God calls. In Hosea chapter 8, Israel has rejected God. In verse 1, we see that, set the trumpet to your lips, like one like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have broken my covenant and transgressed my law. Israel cries to me, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good, and the enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but not with my knowledge. With their silver and their gold, they made idols for their own destruction. All these things, this idolatry, this not consulting God, and in fact, even worse, they've pined after Assyria, which will ultimately be their downfall and their destruction. So in Hosea chapter 9, God promises consequences for their idolatry, especially for the act of disregarding the prophets, the ones who are called to speak prophetically and to have people turn their hearts back to God. In Hosea 7, the days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come. Israel cries, the prophet is a fool, the man of the spirit is mad. Because of your great iniquity, your hostility is great, you say these things. So the idea is that they are speaking lies of the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel all get called individuals who are foolish, who are prophesying things that are unbeneficial to the kings in their day and time, and they're not yes men, and so they get really persecuted because of that. In Hosea 9 verse 10, like grapes in the wilderness I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree, in its first season I saw your ancestors. But they came to Baal Peor, place of false worship, and consecrated themselves to a thing of shame, and became detestable like the thing that they loved. So the consequence of all of this, for the tribe of Ephraim especially, is that they will wither. In verse 17, because you have not listened to him, my God will reject them. They shall become wanderers among the nations. All of this today, these 5 chapters, and Hosea helps remind us that when we turn our hearts away from God, we wander. We are led astray. We have no path. We feel lost. And so whenever you encounter this feeling, may you turn to God. May you turn and trust that God is gracious and merciful, that God wants you to offer not sacrifices in necessarily in physicality, but sacrifices in your spirit. That when you feel particularly attached to something or some way that the future must be, that you be willing to let go of that and to allow God to come into that and open up opportunities. So may you feel free and empowered by God's Spirit, and remember to follow him when you are lost.